Hello everyone, this is Kelly, and today we're going to do a walk through tarot history within the limits and the confines of my historical reproduction collection. However, I do have, thanks to my friend Patrick, who definitely filled in an important hole in the 1500s and other holes. I definitely have one deck for every 100 years of tarot, which is really exciting, and it's really, I think, fascinating to be able to see it. And so for those of you who remember when I did have, you could see my cubicles, I have a cubicle that has all of my historical deck reproductions in it, and so you're going to see all of the tarot decks that are there. I do also keep a Il Minigallo Sibylla deck there, as well as a reproduction of the first Game of Hope, as well as a couple older playing card decks. But today we're just going to run through the 100-year chunks of tarot through the ages, again within the confines and the limits of my little collection. So, you know, history, and especially history of paper items, right, which can be very easily destroyed, it is an iffy thing, right? And I think that there will always be debates upon exact dates and whether or not there were other decks that were not preserved, especially when we're looking at the first two decks. We are looking at really expensively commissioned decks, and so they were on multi-layers of pressed paper, and so they were really thick, and they were painted, and they had gold foil on them and silver foil on them and all of those kinds of things, right? And so those of course are going to be preserved in family collections. When you start to get to playing cards, which is, you know, that people were playing games with on the lower levels of society, those aren't going to be hold up in the same fashion. And so obviously we understand that there are gaps in what we know, and dates are always going to be debated. So the purpose of this video isn't an in-depth history of tarot, rather just a look at, so if we can follow the trajectory of the decks through the 100 years increment, we get a beautiful sort of timeline, visual timeline of tarot through the different time periods. And so that's what I'm focusing on more today. I'm not giving in-depth history of each of these decks. And again, remembering that dates are debated on some, as well as we understand that there are things that are simply missing due to time and due to paper fragility, right? So we're going to start obviously in the 1400s with these three decks, the Sforza being commissioned in 1450, I believe. And so we have an example of the Sforza, the Madrone, and the Sola Busca. Now, what I like about having these two copies, so this is a copy of the Sforza made by Il Minigallo. So I assume, truthfully, if you work with tarot, that you know who Il Minigallo is, but he is an amazing artist who creates decks, reproductions of decks, as well as other art, more modern art style decks as well. But he has a little shop in, well, I'm not sure exactly where it's in now, but I think the shop moved. But anyways, he certainly makes high-end crafted, beautiful paper, handmade, artistic boxes. When you have a El Menegalo deck, especially some of his with a rough paper, you feel like you're holding a deck that was made back in the time in which tarot was being made in small presses, and it's just an absolute treat. But this version of the Sforza is giving us a look at the Sforza as it is now. So if you compare with the Madrone, we have a reproduction of, now this is very glossy cardstock. I think they did a really good job with this, and I have a walkthrough of it, but I wish it wasn't on glossy paper. But we really see the splendor of the gilding that was there. And then whereas with this version of the Sforza, we're really seeing what we would see today if we would be so lucky as to go and see the Sforza today. But these really were individual works of art. You know, this would not have been, my assumption is this would not have been played as the game of Terroco, right? It would have been hung on a wall. I believe the actual, and you can see those here, you can see little holes at the top where these would have, in all of their gilded glory, been hanging on. Can you imagine walking into a room with all of these little pieces of artwork, these little masterpieces just hung on the wall? Like, what an amazing sight that would have been. So we really, again, with these two versions though, get to see sort of what these would have looked like with everything. I mean, look at the dress here. Like, it's just absolutely stunning. I'm so glad, because I mean, these are so beautiful and you feel like you have a piece of history in your hand. But this particular version of being able to really just see it fully gilded and see the deck again, what it would have looked like in its glory, is really a joy to be able to have both of those experiences. So here we can see the beauty of the Sforza. I mean, the minors, you know, we have a running attempt to change some of the language, right? Pips are not unillustrated minors. Pips are illustrated beautifully. If you look at these pips, these are absolutely stunningly illustrated minors. They just don't have scenes in them. And so these are beautifully illustrated pips. It just means that there are just wands in here and just swords, again with all of the floral embellishments. And so this Sforza and the Madrone are examples of illustrated pips, beautifully illustrated pips that just simply don't have any scenes in them until you get to the quartz. Now, one of the joys about the Madrone quartz is that we actually have a male and a female page. We have a male and a female knight. And then we have a queen and a king. So the quartz system is quite beautifully extended. I absolutely love that. And I mean, just look at those. Look at those. Can you imagine holding those in reality back in the day when you're holding gold? I guess you probably wouldn't be touching that much, would you? But yeah, so one of the things that this is stands apart though is that extended quartz system, which is really gorgeous. So we have that. And then the Sola Busca, from what I understand, and again, all these dates are really varied, are what we have an example of here is what would have come after these decks here. But what we have here is quite different, especially in the majors, to what we would have seen in the decks that we think of. And also I think that this belays the notion, because one of the other misinformations I think that gets spread is that the Rider-Waite-Smith was the first scenic miners, so miners with people in them. We can see that that is not the case. And this is from the 1400s, and we already have here, you can see where the Rider-Waite-Smith pulled. We know that Pamela Coleman Smith saw the Sola Busca in a museum, and so there are a couple of the cards in the Rider-Waite-Smith taken from the Sola Busca. There are Pippish, but we also do have people and scenes going on in the so you can see the 7 here of swords being taken also, and I believe the 10 of wands was maybe taken from the 10 of swords. Yeah, so we can clearly see that as early back as the 1400s, there were scenic miners. But remember that these were playing card decks, right? So these were decks that were used to play a game. And so you can imagine if you were playing a game, it's actually going to be far easier to kind of scan whatever you're doing and see what you have if it's just the pips there and we don't have people confusing what's going on in the scene, right? So you can certainly understand why there was a prevalence of pips that did not have people or scenes in them. But it was certainly not, the Rider-Waite-Smith was certainly not the first scenic tarot deck, and that's something I've certainly heard. So this would have been in the 1400s. As far as we're aware at this time in history, right, these are what we have. And again, there's other bits and bobs of possibilities and couple cards that may have been decks or may not have been decks. There's, you know, there's always speculation when we're talking about history, and especially when we're talking about history that is on paper crafting. Because my assumption is, right, my assumption is that we don't start the game with the the trumps being added to the playing cards. So it starts as regular playing card system, and then the trumps or the major arcanas are added on. My assumption is that very first time of doing that is not made in a deck like this, right? This is just my assumption. I am not a historian, but my assumption is that we don't just go from minors with no triumphs or trumps on it to hand-painted masterpieces of a deck with an expanded court and a trump on top, system on top of it. My guess is there were probably some before this that just simply weren't this beautiful, lots of pressed layers of paper that are preserved and passed down by family to, from family to family member. And so my guess is that there would be some that were not quite so extravagant that didn't survive. But that's just my own personal historical guess. Maybe it did just crop into full glory in these particular cards. But anyways, we're at the 1400s. Now, when we move to the 1500s, actually it's slim pickings. I remember when my friend Patrick was, his goal was a few years back to, now we're going to have problems with me where to place stuff. His goal was to get a deck or two from every 100 years of history, and one of his problem spots was the 1500s. And so I have one example of a tarot deck from the 1500s, and I quite love this. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. So this deck is lovingly from me entitled the CrossEyed Tarot, because every single person in this deck has crossed eyes. Now, dates are iffy on this one. It sounds like it was designed late in the 1400s and printed early in the 1500s. But we're putting this at the 1500s. But if you look closely, every single person in here has crossed eyes. I really would love to know, like, why that is the case. Like, what, because it can't be a mistake, right? Nobody thought that all of people's pupils are supposed to be, you know, crossed. So why is it that it's just the question of the tarot ages are, why is there a whole deck of cross-eyed people? We don't know. We don't we don't know. But this is, it's a sweet deck. It has lots of things that stand out here. You know, I love the animal here standing out. The people, like the hairstyles are really, I love the way that the hair is done. It looks like with the braiding. And again, just really do love the, do really love the cross-eyed people. So, you know, it's a simple pips. We don't see it overly embellished, but they're still very pretty. Again, I love the use of animals here. I love the use of curved swords. I like curved swords and straight wands. It just makes it easiest to be able to see. But yeah, they're all cross-eyed. The world of tarot wants to know why the Budapest Tarot is all cross-eyed. And here we can see an example of the backs. So obviously this is a reproduction of the Budapest, and again, this is fitting the slot of the 1500s. Now, in the 1600s, we have an important deck. I'm going to zoom back out. I guess we'll stay a little zoomed in though, so we can see things. We have an important deck in the in the Noblet, because this is a deck that really we look to for solidifying the Marseille pips, and really kind of coming to a consensus or a standard of a particular pattern in the pips. And so, you know, I say this all the time, all Marseille decks are pip decks, but not all pip decks are Marseille decks. In the modern context, you know, you could look at the Marseille decks and say, okay, there's two things that could make a deck a Marseille deck. Either it came out of Marseille, right? Or it is a, in a modern context, when people will say a Marseille decks, we're talking about decks that have a specific pip pattern. So the pattern of how the pips are laid out follow a couple examples of that, of how to lay those out. So in a modern context, when we're saying a Marseille deck, what we really mean is a deck that is reproduced off of these pip configurations. And so we see this really start to really solidify with the Noblet in the 1600s, as well as with the Dodal, I believe is in the 1700s, which we'll get to, and those kind of being the standard for Marseille pip reading. But again, as you can see, even in this, you know, smaller produced, you know, or more mass, what I would say would be, it would have been more mass produced for the masses, right? That while the pips are don't have people in them, they are not unillustrated. They have flourishes and things in them. They have directionality and they have color things that are all red. And so Marseille as a style of reading isn't without its structure and its standards. It is using the colors, the directionality, the flourishes, direction of how you read it directionally on the card. There is a way of reading that is considered to be reading in a Marseille style, and that comes out of these decks, and they were certainly solidified with the Noblet and the Dodal. And so when some decks, modern decks, are mislabeled as being Marseille decks just because they have pips. So just because a deck has pips does not make it a Marseille deck. So Marseille is a tradition and a way of reading specific patterns. So I think that that is important to, you know, highlight here. So we have that example, and then we have one of my favorites. This is a beautiful, beautiful deck called the Della Torre, and this is my friend Patrick had bought this for me for my birthday a couple years ago because this looks like Justice, which is one of my cards as a Libra, looks like me when I was younger. So yeah, this was me in a past life, having, you know, sat in for this artist. But this is just a beautiful example of, I guess, would be Bolognese art. You know, you have, I feel like you go to, I'll be honest, and I'm going to show you one that I absolutely love. I'm not a huge fan of the woodcut style decks. Obviously they were made because you could then make many of them much easier than somebody hand making and drawing and painting a deck, right? So we understand why there were many of them, but they're not my favorite visually. I'm not a huge fan of the woodcut look, while I know many people are. I love this style where it is just beautiful. The faces are soft. The colors here are just stunning. And obviously these are, you know, this is an older deck, so who knows what the colors would have looked like, you know, straight out of the gate. Devil cards in these older decks are absolutely my favorite thing to go look to see what they did with the devil, but this is definitely high up there as one of my favorites. You have some real simplicity in the pips, which I think is beautiful, but the faces of the people in this are just what I think are just beautiful. The clothing is just gorgeous, and this really stands out. Did I show the backs of the Noblet? Here's the backs of the Noblet. This really stands out because it actually has this beautiful scenic backing with Cupid that, you know, you really don't see a lot of, or I haven't seen a lot of in historical decks. So it really stands out. And this is another Il Menegalo deck, and it has the absolute favorite shuffling. It has a swish swish feel that is just stunning. So these would have been examples, and again, from my limited collection of decks from the 1600s. Now I'm getting off here. 1600s. So then we get to the 1700s, and I actually have quite a few decks from the 1700s. Apparently that was a popular deck mating, or we're getting to the point in which the decks can, you know, survive a little bit more. This first one here is the Besacon, and this would have been from the literally 1700s. Here's an example of the back. And here's the examples. You know, you can just see the fronts. This is really quite a beautiful deck. Again, it's, you know, it's not a style that I absolutely love. I mean, I do love, I just love the devils. Like this, I will always look to the devils. But these are beautiful minors. Again, flourishes here. These are illustrated pips. I always look to the Two of Pentacles because they're often done really beautiful. I love Three of Pentacles. For me personally, I always look to the sevens because I prefer my sevens to be in that configuration where I can set it like this and have the 4 plus the 3 at the top. So that's my preferred configuration. So I tend to look at older decks like this. I tend to look at the Devil because I just love how they're depicted, and I tend to look at the Seven of Pentacles. So that would have been in 1700. This is a reproduction of the Dodal, which we talked about as being really important in the Marseille tradition, the Noblet and the Dodal. This would have been in 1701. So I love the little antlers on this devil card. Again, gorgeous. Certainly illustrated. Is this the one? Sometimes some of these historical decks you also get really wandering nipples on the women. I think maybe that was more on the Noblet. I'll have to take a look. I do really like the color tones, and again, I don't, you know, obviously do we know what actually it looked like when it came out, but I like the use of blues, at least in the reproduction. I do like that the blues really stand out in this one compared to at least the version of the Noblet that I have. So that would be the Dodal in 1701. Now this is a great, I have two examples of this deck, but this is the Minchiate Eturia. This is a different card game that has expanded. So it has the virtues in the majors, it has the, it's upside down, has the virtues in the majors, it has the astrological signs, it has the elements. So this was a different playing card game. It was a little bit more complex, but it is absolutely gorgeous. I have read with this. This is the Lo Scarabeo version, which is a reproduction of the Eturia, Minchiate Eturia, which would have been in 1725. And then I have another example of one from the 1800s. But I will say the art is, again, how I really love it. It's got that similar feel to like the Soprafino. It's just beautifully, beautifully done. Absolutely gorgeous. Now, from my understanding, like, we don't have anything talking about, and of course that's the case with a lot of tarot decks, we don't have anything talking about, you know, this being used in divination, although I believe there was a reference to, I think, the majors of this deck, that they think, in terms of using it as a spell work, sort of calling forth the god, a particular god, that they think that they were referencing the majors to this deck, which of course we also see with some other decks as well. But yeah, so that's a really wonderful deck there. Now this is a redrawing of the 1760 Convor Tarot. So Yoav Bendov redid the line work of the Convor, and this is again also an important deck, and so he redid the line work, and so this is a beautiful representation. I use this one a lot. We do have weird, like with these style decks, things that kind of creep me out about these type of decks are sometimes the people look like they're wearing skin clothes, which is really strange. Again, I love the antlers here. We often have mixed genitalia with the devils. And so the weird skin clothing look kind of creeps me out. We sometimes have the wandering nipples. We don't in this one. We sometimes have crossed eyes, interesting things. But I do really love again, you can see these are very much illustrated pips. They just don't have people in them. Love that. So this is a beautiful deck, and again, this was cleaning up, but he didn't change anything. There is also a Jodorowsky version redoing of the Convor, but he does make changes to it, whereas the CBD Tarot is a redrawing of the Convor that stays faithful to the lines. So that's a great one to have in your collection. Now, this one was recently sent to me by my friend Patrick when he periodically clears out his collection. He's a minimalist on decks, very much unlike me. And so I benefit from that. I'm in love with this deck. As I said, I don't generally like the woodcut look, whether it's actual woodcut or not. That look of the woodcut is just not my favorite. This is a really special reproduction of the Tarot Vandermere Tarot Flamande Vanderboer. And the artist Pablo Robledo is who redid it. There was, I think, a small number of these that he redid. But this is a deck from 1762. And this is 15 of a 28 card run. I am in love with this deck. I'm absolutely in love with this deck. It is kind of that woodcutty style, like flat imagery, but it's so sweet. The people are, I just love the faces on the people. I love the movement of it. I love the flourishes on the minors. I'm really a fan of this deck. I've never held a deck that was in this style, close to like a woodcut style. Whether this was woodcut or not, I'm not a historian. But this one I'm absolutely in love with it. I love that the Hanged Man here is standing upright unless it's in its reverse. So that I love about this deck. I also love, I just love the people in this one. I love my understanding, and this is limited understanding. My understanding is this is the first time we have a tree in the tower position here. Just look at how beautiful the illustrations are on this. So I love this. And then there's the Hermit. There's something else. Oh, the Hierophant. I shuffled this. The Hierophant is Bacchus, which I also love. Yeah, see, instead of the Hierophant, there were certain times in history where the Pope was not very happy about having his likeness or even the position of the Pope in a playing card deck, right, that was used for gambling and was often banned, right? And so we see in this one, Bacchus is here. We have, I know, one with Jupiter. Is it Jupiter and Juno in the JJ switch? We'll look at that in a minute. So there were times in which the Pope was like, no, do not have a Pope in playing card deck. And so I love this with Bacchus here. It just has a very pagan feel to it. I mean, look at how gorgeous the illustrations are. This has fast become a absolute favorite for me, and I never thought I would have a favorite in this style, but this is the case. So this is the Vanderboer, and this would have been in 1760. And then we do have, of course, important to state, the Etteilla deck. This is a reproduction of the Etteilla deck, which would have been in 1791. And this is notable because it is seen as the first deck that was created specifically for divination. Now, again, this is not tarot history. There are all kinds of problematic natures to Etteilla and his sort of attempt to write the history of tarot. But regardless, he was definitely more of a cartomancer, and so we see some of that cartomancy style in his decks and carry forward. But it's an important deck because it was the first that we know was made for the purpose of divination. I know I didn't show all of the backs. I'm kind of being bad at that. But so that would have been in 1791. So these are the decks that I have in my collection in the 1700s. And so you can really see there's a broad range, notably, again, the Minchiate. Although the Minchiate is much earlier. There is references of the Minchiate, I believe, in the 1400s. But this is the existing deck that we have, as well as the Florintine, which I'll show in a minute. So the Minchiate, to me, is I'm very fascinated by the Minchiate system and those additional cards coming into play. And so I love having an example of this. This is Lo Scarabeo, but it's not easy to find. My friend Etteilla literally found 2 of these, and I can't remember because she also found a really good deal on the first edition of the Mythic Tarot, but she found these when they've been out of print and they're hard to find like just tucked away in a shop for really cheap, and that was really an exciting find. So I'm glad to have those. Okay, so that is the 1700s. So we have come from the 1400s through to the 1700s, and we're going to shift gears to the next 1800s here. This is a deck, this was actually my very first historical deck that my friend Waite sent to me, and this is the Terroco di Marcigula, and this was from 1804, and so here we again have quite an example of a woodcut style. Again, beautiful. Miners are just so gorgeous. So I really do take high offense. I love the blue-skinned dead people. I really do take personal offense at pips being called, you know, versus, you know, say Rider-Waite-Smith being illustrated, and then they'll say unillustrated pips or unillustrated miners, and I really do take strong offense to that. There are very simple ones. I love her. There are very simple ones that I absolutely love, and then there are really gorgeous ones as well. So they run the gamut. So this is the Marsigula, and this would have been in 1804. So then we come to an example of very simple miners with one of my absolute favorite decks of all time, the Terroco Neoclassico. And this would have been in 1810. I adore this deck. It is one of my all-time favorite. Look at this beautiful simplicity of the miners here. I love this deck so much. I love Justice. I love the miners. I love the pentacles. I love the Debonair Devil. I love everything. I love the Hermit. There isn't anything. I love the Death card. I love the Fool. I love love this Empress. Oh, she's gorgeous. I just love everything about this deck. I love the Tower. Like, I mean, come on. Like, it's just so sweet and so beautiful. It's just an absolute treat to me, and is one of my all-time favorite tarot decks. So that would have been from 1810. Now, the J.J. Swiss, this is obviously a reproduction of the J.J. Swiss. This, you can see some question on the first renditions of this being maybe the 1830s, and then kind of going outward from there. And this continued to be produced, obviously. This version is, I don't know from when this is. 70s maybe. Let's see, I can see a date down here, but I can't really, with wrong glasses. It looks like this version is 1974. The coloration on this is very strange with sort of the browns. You don't see that a lot, so I like to see that browns. You do kind of have orangey skin here, but I do love the inclusion of browns in this deck, which are quite beautiful. And then I believe that this is the, look, I mean, look at how gorgeous these are. These are beautiful, beautiful miners. Look at her. Of course, I always like to look at the Queen of Swords. But I believe, let me see if I can find it. I love the Tower there. Again, I really love the use of browns in this deck. Look at that Hermit. But I believe this is the one that, I mean, the Queens are gorgeous. The miners are just stunning in this deck. Really probably one of my favorite miners. Look at the Star. Let me find, okay, I'll probably have to, yeah, here. So we have the, what would have been the Hierophant or the Pope, well, at the time would have been the Pope, is Jupiter, and the, what would be the High Priestess or the Papist would have been, is Juno. And again, my understanding is, historically accurate or not, I know that there were times in which it was banned to put the Pope on playing cards, and so in this case we have Jupiter and Juno here. So what I love about this deck is the minors are absolutely stunning. I love the inclusion of brown here, and then I love the Jupiter and Juno. So that is this particular deck. My friend Bart found this for a really fantastic price. I really think, I don't remember what I paid for this, but it was something ridiculously cheap. So again, time frame of this, I'm not entirely sure, because again, this one's 1974, but the one JJ Swiss, there are, I think it would have been mid-1800s. So then here we have, this is the Minchiate Florintine, which would have been in 1850. This is an Il Meligallo version of this. Absolutely love this Minchiate. I need to do a comparison of the two Minchiates that I have, but this is so gorgeous. And of course, because this was a gift from my friend Bart, and this has that gorgeous paper that just swishes that I absolutely adore. Yeah, I mean, this is just a gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous deck. And so this would have been an example of the Minchiate from the 1850s. So we have that. And then we have, this is a remaking, so this is a low scarabeo deck called Tarot of the Masters. And this would have been a remaking from the Vacchetta. And the Vacchetta would have been in 1893. Now, I love this because this really blows out of the water. Let's zoom in again. This really blows out of the water. The idea that Rider-Waite Smith had the first scenic minors, because this deck, now this has been muted. This is one of my all-time favorite devils. Like, look at that devil card. This is a pastel version. I believe the original version is quite bright, or is much more brighter tones, but I love this version. Like, I prefer, look, I mean, look at this. This is a stunning deck. Like, there's nothing, there's no, again, certainly scenic, right? The scenic that we know, and, well, of course that's a major, so I guess that's not fair, but look at these minors. Look at what's happening in these minors. So yeah, definitely, certainly blows out of the water any idea that there weren't beautiful and scenic minors prior to the Rider-Waite Smith. Of course, we see that in the 1400s with the Sola Busca, but whatever. So this is so beautiful, and again, it's one you can pick up. It's mass market. It's low scarabeo. You just have to look under Tarot of the Master for this. But this is a reproduction of the Vacchetta from 1893. And then, of course, if you've watched my channel enough, you know that the Ancient Italian Tarot by Lo Scarabeo is one of my absolute favorite decks. And it has two different decks that it uses. It has the Avondo minors, which are my favorite minors of all time. Although I will be honest, it definitely struggled. The JJ Swiss minors are so stunning as well, but I would say that these are I mean, look at how beautiful this is. So the minors are from the Avondo from 1880, and the majors are from the Soprafino, which is in 1835. Now, I like this combination. I know historians will roll over in their graves. Look at that card. Look at those minors. But I prefer this than the Soprafino minors. So this combination of the Soprafino and the Avondo is my absolute favorite. I just think it makes a perfect, stunning, look at her. It just makes a stunning, stunning, illustrated, very illustrated pip deck with the, and it's something that you can pick up mass market, which is great, right? Because it's expensive. Il Meligallo decks, I feel like, are the absolute treat. Like if you think of any tarot deck for me that is sort of like the elite of having a tarot deck, it would certainly be an El Menegalo, because they're just, the craftsmanship is something that you just can't get that type of a deck anywhere else. But I do also appreciate when we can have access to these beautiful decks in a mass market form. So these represent the 1800s. So that brings us to the 1900s, right? And the important Golden Dawn decks. And I know that I have some issue with the Rider-Waite-Smith. It isn't my base way that I learned to read tarot from. And so... And I do think it's a bit of a hodgepodge. Again, from my opinion, it's a bit of a hodgepodge because we know it was taken from, different things were taken. We see things taken from the Sola Busca, we see things taken from Etteilla, we see things lifted from meanings for the swords, like pulling straight from a cartomancy source, but then not all of the minors were pulled that way. And so we definitely see this sort of... grabbing here from various things that I do think can cause some in lack of cohesion, especially obviously mostly in the minors. But there is no getting away from the fact that the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot, which was published in 1909, certainly becomes the basis for English-speaking tarot. There's just no question that that is the case. What's important, I think, to remember with the Rider-Waite-Smith is that this is a deck that's very specifically tied to the correspondences of the magical society or esoteric society of the Golden Dawn. And so if those correspondences are ones that you agree with and that work with, because they're a very astrological base, there are different ways to associate astrology to tarot, and the Golden Dawn is one of those. And so it can work really beautiful. It's a stunning system that has held the test of time certainly in the English-speaking world, and most of our decks today are based on the Rider-Waite-Smith system. And so it's an important deck that came out in 1909. Now, another deck that came out of the Golden Dawn tradition would be the Thoth Tarot, which was from Aleister Crowley. And so we have this coming out in 1944. And so again, these are based off of Crowley's interpretations of the correspondences of the Golden Dawn, and the work by Lady Frida Harris versus by Pamela Coleman Smith here. The artwork is stunning. The minors in this are absolutely, I mean, they're all stunning, but the minors in particular are absolutely gorgeous. It is a system of its own. My friend Patrick and I were just talking about, like, what does it mean that we have, say, the Marseille system? Like, are these really different systems, or are they just variants, right, of tarot? But, in my head, you can't read in the Thoth style without having the Thoth deck, or or sort of a redoing of the Thoth deck, right? Because there are differences there. And so you need a Thoth deck or a Thoth inspired deck to read in the Thoth tradition. You need Marseille, I talked about that. It's not just about pips, but to read in the Marseille tradition, you need a Marseille deck. You need a deck with the appropriate flourishes, the appropriate colors, the appropriate configuration of the pips to read Marseille, which makes it its kind of separate system, right? And then the same thing with the Rider-Waite-Smith. Like, you need a Rider-Waite-Smith deck or a based deck to read exactly as the Rider-Waite-Smith lines out the numbers and things of that nature. Now, of course, you can take any of those things and put them onto a pip deck other than the Marseille, but you can certainly, if you just know the Thoth system so well, you can certainly pick up a pip deck and be able to read in that tradition, right? As well as you can take a pip deck and simply read in the tradition of the Rider-Waite-Smith, but it is a system that is tied to this specific deck. So I do see those as systems of tarot, versus say somebody like myself, who I read very numerological, following the progression of the numbers, combined with the elements of the suits, and then of course the archetypes of the majors, and of course then for me the courts are very much about how energy is moving. So my way of reading isn't really tied to one system, and so I can move in and out. Like I can use a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, but I do have to, you know, excuse a couple decks that get in the way of the way that I read. So for me, an ideal deck is a pip deck, or a deck that doesn't sort of restrict the numerological flow of the minors. And so that isn't a system. The way that I read is not a system. It's just it's just a personal way of reading, versus something like the Marseille system where you need a Marseille deck to read with it, or the Thoth system where you need a Thoth deck to work within that system, and so on and so forth. So we have these sort of different systems within tarot, but then outside of that, of course, we know that tarot would have been used and read in a variety of different ways. We have no clue the various different ways in which a person picked up a pack of cards and used that to read. And even today, you have people who, associate the elements different, don't use the elements at all in tarot reading. You have people who read intuitively, and they only look at the images and what comes up, and they have no sort of foundational historical, as much as that's possible, like and there's no base of a tradition. Like they don't start from the Rider-Waite-Smith meanings and then, you know, kind of extrapolate from there, but they just read intuitively from the images on the card decks. So there's a lot of ways in which people come in and find their own path with tarot. And I think that what we see is in all of this is the beauty of tarot, to be able to have this beautiful bone structure that allows for correspondences to the nth degree, right, to be thrown on top of it, or being taken down to its simplest forms, of being able to read with it, and then everything that is in between those extremes, right? You can have this really sort of read what you see type style reading, where you're just looking at what you're seeing. You're not extrapolating. You're not embellishing. You're just this is this and this, right? Then you have the other extreme where there's tons of correspondences just layered and layered and layered on top of tarot. And then again, everything in between those two, right? And the bone structure of tarot allows for this beautiful ability to make it into what works. For me, what is important isn't that, oh, I'm a Marseille reader, so I'm better than everybody else, or, oh, I'm a Rider-Waite-Smith reader, that's the only way to read tarot, or I'm a Thoth reader and nobody else knows how to read tarot if you're not a Thoth reader. You know, believe me, every single camp has their people that says this is the right way and everybody else is less than. Unfortunately, human beings like to claim things. But the fact of the matter is that tarot, with its beautiful bone structure and its ability to allow people to read as they want to read with it, the key then is just consistency. If the Marseille reader is reading their style consistently, they will get clean readings. Same thing with all the other systems. If I've developed the way that I read over the years and I apply those things consistently, I'm not going to get muddy readings. It's when you really start to kind of weave in and out, and it gets a bit of a muddle if we're not have any kind of consistency. And we see this problem, you know, we now live in an era in which there is a flood, a literal flood of tarot decks on the market, and some of them are, say, based off of the Rider-Waite-Smith. Many of them are based off of the Rider-Waite-Smith system, and yet a lot of them are not. Many of them now, I shouldn't say a lot, I don't know, there are, you know, you can run into decks that are a mismatch of things. We can run into decks that were created by people who've never read tarot. They're just doing it as a, you know, as something to sell, and so they just kind of pull here and there, and there's no cohesiveness to the decks because they clearly never read tarot, right? And so we are in this place in which somebody could pick up a tarot deck that is just a mishmash, and that is going to be a really hard entry into the world of tarot when you know, when you find yourself in the position of a deck that you know, it wasn't created by tarot readers for tarot readers, or doesn't follow any set tradition. Now you can see blendings that are beautiful where people can take the best of the what works for them and create beautiful decks that are open and expressive to the system. But you can also see muddled decks, right, that just create a big muddy mess. One of the things that I should have brought out, and let me grab that real quick. This is I have a whole video about the Picard minors, but you can mass market pick up a deck called the Universal Wirth Tarot. And what I like here is that we have Wirth, who was writing in the late 1800s, and he was really focused on the major arcana. In fact, I don't think he saw much use for the minor arcana at all. And so this deck has the majors from the Wirth, but the minors are from Eudes Picard. And he wrote in 1909 about the fact that there's so much information that was delved into esoterically about the majors. But nobody was talking about how to unify the minors numerologically. Now later we do see some people starting to talk about that as well, but in terms of at this time period, there just wasn't a unification of how to approach the minors. And so Eudes Picard made a deck that really trying to bring about some sort of structure to the ways in which you would approach the minor cards. And so this is a great mass market deck that you're able to pick up that does give you those Wirth majors, and then Eudes Picard's minors. There's several decks that do it. Again, I have a couple videos on Eudes Picard things as well. So there's a couple decks, but this is one that's nice because it has those two combined together. So while, you know, in 1909, while I believe there's a lot of pulling from a variety of sources, right, with the Rider-Waite-Smith minors, in the same time period, Picard was really trying to bring some cohesiveness and some consistency to those numerical structures of the minors in interesting ways. Now, he does approach the elements differently, but there are examples of different elements as well in other ways, so that's not too surprising. But I just love the way he approached the minors and put the emphasis to them. So I said, okay, let's stop focusing so much on the majors. There's a lot going on here in the minors, and let's pay attention to that. So we're seeing both of those things going on in the early 1900s. So I did want to bring that up as well, even though this deck obviously was not created at that time, but it is off of, I believe, Wirth's deck was, did it say in this? I think Wirth's deck was later. This is the 1926 version of Wirth's deck, but I believe Eudes Picard would have been earlier than that. His minors, his deck would have been earlier, and I know that he wrote about the minors in 1909, the same year that the Rider-Waite-Smith deck came out. So I see we have light seeping in over here, but I'm going to stop babbling right now. Of course, then we go into an explosion of decks from here, and every other deck review on my channel gives you the full glory, right, of decks from the 20th century and into the 21st century, right? So we have many, many examples of that, but I'm just going to stop here with these early decks in the 1900s. So I hope that you've enjoyed this, just sort of, again, walk through the history of tarot by 100-year increments, again, through the limited gaze of what I have. But when you in 2021 are picking up a tarot deck, understanding and maybe being able to see a little bit more visually the way that you're actually pulling from a long and rich and beautiful tradition. And many times am thankful for, again, the beautiful bone structure of tarot that allows so much, holds so much, and allows for so much diversity of ways of thinking and seeing symbology and being able to get messages from the divine, from the universe, from the collective unconscious, from your own internal realms. It's just, it holds space for many ways of reading that is beautiful to behold. So I will talk to you all later.